All right, what's going on, everyone? So today we're going to take a look at some updates related to the ongoing war in Ukraine. We're going to focus on some battlefield moves, updates around the new Russian offensive in Kharkiv, the northeastern portion of Ukraine, and then some assessments, opinions about the new Russian defense minister. So let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to start with a map overview here. We're going to use Suryak maps today. Looking at this and deep state maps, which I traditionally use, I saw a bit of a difference. The Suryak map tends to show right now, during the course of this offensive, more Russian progress in a few areas that lines up more with statements that are coming from the Russian sources at this point. The challenge right now is we're not getting a lot of information from Ukrainian sources about the status and the progress of the fighting at the front in terms of how far Russian forces have advanced. So we're going to use Suryak map, but keep in mind this could represent the most optimistic point of view from the Russian perspective. Now, starting here zoomed out, looking at all of Ukraine, the majority of the fighting over the last few months, even years, has been focused on this eastern portion here. However, this recent Russian offensive has taken place in the northern portion in and around Kharkiv. There are really three main reasons that Russia has likely kicked this off. First and foremost, we've talked about this in previous videos, is to create, and Russian sources are talking about this a lot, creating some sort of buffer zone here to prevent not necessarily drone strikes into Belgorod and other portions of Russian territory, but potentially to secure some of that border region to prevent crossings, cross-border raids carried out by Ukrainian forces, threatening Belgorod or the Belgorod region. That's option number one. Option number two, and these all could be true for what it's worth. Option number two is to tie up Ukrainian forces so they can't be used elsewhere, other portions of the front like Chasiv Yar down here west of Bakhmut that continues to see a focus of the fighting. They're pulling Ukrainian forces up near Kharkiv, thinning out the lines elsewhere. This is also possibly being done in preparation for a further summer offensive somewhere else along the front. And then third, and I would argue that this one is probably not necessarily the main goal, but maybe works out this way for Russian forces, is if they're able to continue to push forward and can bring Kharkiv into tube artillery range, right? It's already in MLRS and missile range, but if they can bring it into tube artillery range, generally 20 kilometers and less, that means they're going to be able to bombard that city pretty regularly with 122, 152 millimeter ammunition. And that's generally how they've taken cities throughout this war, right? Hammer it with artillery, be able to slowly push the forces forward. So those are kind of the three main reasons that we're likely seeing this Russian offensive in Kharkiv that is new, right? This isn't an area Russia has really pushed since the opening days of the war in 2022. Now, looking at a couple different sources here, starting with War Gonzo, what we've got today are actually kind of unofficial sources, which have proven to be more reliable especially coming from the Russian side over the last few years, really. So we're going to take a look at a few of those. War Gonzo says, fierce fighting continues in Vovchansk. Zoom in here to show where that is. Right here is the area he's talking about. He said it's too early to talk about a complete liberation of the city. The northern part of the settlement is under control of the Russian armed forces. The artillery and aviation of the Russian troops are actively working on positions of the armed forces of Ukraine. So starting to see Russian forces move into Vovchansk here, the northern portion of that city. Now, the Ukrainian perspective talking about that is coming from United 24. And I felt like it's worth bouncing around a little bit here. They have some reporters out in Ukraine, of course, providing feedback. They say specifically about Vovchansk, they say the situation in the city is difficult. The enemy continues to try to gain a foothold on the outskirts and advance deep into the settlement in order to set up positions. The defense forces, the Ukrainian defense forces, are trying to contain the pressure, prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold, inflicting damage on the enemy. The northern part of Vovchansk passes into the gray area. Fighting continues. Shelling is being carried out throughout the district. So that's where you see a little bit of the difference here between Deep State and, this is United 24. But when you look at the Deep State map, a little bit of a difference there versus what we're hearing from some of the Russian sources. Ukraine is still referring to some of this area in the northern part of Vovchansk as the gray area, whereas Russian sources are starting to say that they have occupied portions of this settlement and are continuing to push further south. Now, continuing on with some of the Russian assessments here, Rybar is referring to the halt at Kharkiv. This is something that kicked off about a week ago. We saw pretty significant progress in the first day. It's largely not moved a lot since then. Now, another argument is that it's moved kind of at the pace that we've seen most Russian offensives move at for a long time now, and that is slow and steadily moving forward, but it's not been rapid. And there's a couple thoughts on that. Again, Rybar talking about this halt at Kharkiv. They say that Zelensky stated that the Ukrainian forces managed to stop the advance of the Russian army, and then the top Ukrainian commander, Syrsky, claims there is a risk of encirclement of the Kharkiv group of forces by the Russian military. Zooming out here, the Kharkiv group of forces largely in this area here. They say that both of these things could be true at the same time. Again, according to Rybar, they say more than 30 Ukrainian battalions have been redeployed to the sector. For comparison, they estimate that over here in Chasiv Yar, there's only around 18 battalions, 15 to 18 Ukrainian battalions. I'm not certain on the numbers there. That's going to be a complicated one to try to get the force numbers of military actively in the fight. They say that given that the Russian armed forces have only taken the first line of defense and the gray zone, the enemy now has redeployed significant forces to the pre-prepared positions. They need to be dislodged and put out of action. So again, notable there, Rybar talking about how the gray zone has been occupied, this empty area generally between the front lines of forces. They're also talking about how the first line of defense for the Ukrainian forces has been taken. That's something that's always been contentious, arguing about where exactly the first line of defense is, not just during Russian advances, but also during Ukrainian advances. Rybar here is saying that some of those first line defenses have so far been taken. They added that the encirclement of the armed forces of Ukraine is indeed possible if the Russian armed forces launched an offensive in the Sumy region in conjunction with the Kharkiv region. This scenario is possible. The armed forces of Ukraine is betting too heavily on holding the first line of defense. So to zoom out here and give you an idea of what that would look like, Sumy up here northwest of Kharkiv, this is an area where Russian forces poured across the border in the opening days of the invasion, but by and large, there hasn't been a lot of fighting on Ukrainian territory since then, since Russian forces were pushed out shortly after the invasion, all things considered. So yes, it's possible, but now we're talking about this large, big pincer movement coming from Sumy and Kharkiv to try to isolate a large group of Ukrainian forces. Again, we've talked about this before. You have to keep that in the back of your mind as maybe the most dangerous enemy course of action from Ukrainians' perspective. But that's also not something that we've seen Russia be able to pull off yet in this war. In the early days of the fighting, there was a lot of concern that they were going to try to conduct something like that over here in the Donbass and chop off, essentially the entire Donbass, right? Move maybe from Sumy, maybe from Kharkiv down towards Zaporozhye, north from Melitopol, north from Mariupol, and really cut off a huge amount of Ukrainian armed forces. And clearly now, looking back, that wasn't really in the cards. So something to keep an eye on. I don't know that that would be the primary fear right now from the Ukrainian perspective. Now, we do have more of sticking with some Russian perspectives here. Again, we're hearing a lot more from the Russian side right now than the Ukrainian side. So that's going to end up being where we're getting the majority of our information. So as we're going through any of these reports, again, recognize that these are probably more rosy of a picture, just how this war has played out. When you only have Russian reports, they tend to be more optimistic towards the Russian side. When you only have Ukrainian reports, they tend to be more optimistic from the Ukrainian side. This series of events playing out right now in Kharkiv is primarily Russian reporting. Two majors had another Russian mill blogger here had an interesting assessment coming in from someone who says they are actively fighting on the Kharkiv front, so more of a tactical view of what is happening up here. He said, "My unit has now left Vovchansk for temporary respite. From what I saw, I can confidently say that the enemy's drones and artillery in this section of the front are very significant. Unfortunately, our counter battery cannot fully work against the enemy. In some places, it is simply impossible to move to a position due to the density of drones, and some vehicles have severely worn barrels." Vehicles talking about some of the artillery, maybe even mortars there, not able to operate and conduct significant counter battery fires. So when artillery, the counter battery fire, what that is when one side fires rockets, mortars, artillery, or even operates drones, can loosely be used in this context. Counter battery is your side's ability to identify that launch site and strike it with your own munitions. This Russian soldier, is saying counter battery is having a bit of an issue in the Kharkiv region right now, and the density of drones and artillery fire is significant. He says, as a result, they're trying to solve this problem with FABs, the large guided bombs that can be launched from around 40 kilometers away. Very significant, causes a serious amount of damage, and we've already seen a lot of pictures and videos of those being used in the Kharkiv direction. They say, but there are not enough of these for everyone. The birds fly nonstop from the airfields to the positions and back. The situation with drones is a stalemate. You just hide. We suppress Mavics easily, but almost nothing works against the FPVs. Which is interesting. It's always interesting hearing as this drone war kind of develops. So the Mavics are like quadcopters dropping grenades, maybe just spotting for artillery. They say those are easily suppressed, whether that means that they just can't function or they're shot down or they're jammed to where they have to land, whatever. The Mavics are not something they're concerned about, but the FPVs, these small racer drones, first-person view drones with an RPG or other type of warhead attached, and essentially turn into a small missile, saying nothing works against the FPVs. They say, on a positive note, our units are confidently staying on the ground. We are digging in as soon as the opportunity arises and are fully entrenched. The FABs generally work great. This is our trump card against which nothing sensible has yet been invented. And this is nothing surprising, right? These glide bombs that Russia has been employing now for a few months pretty successfully, they've taken a toll on the Ukrainian defenses, especially a situation like this where Russia is coming up against a Ukrainian line of defense and they're having to find a way to break through that line of defense. This is one of these FABs are one of the things that kind of are credited with breaking the Ukrainian lines in places like Avdiivka, and it's happening now around Chasiv Yar. So they're significantly bigger, a lot more boom than you get with the artillery. There's fewer of them, but when one of these FAB bombs strikes home, it can take out a significant portion of the Ukrainian line. So that appears to be, again, according to this Russian soldier, what they're relying on, their trump card in the Kharkiv direction right now. He closes by saying, it's not an easy walk, that's for sure. It feels like we will have to fight for Kharkov. Yeah, I would imagine that there's going to be a fight for the city if they continue pressing. I'm not sure if they thought that maybe the Ukrainian forces would just retreat at this point or give up the city. Hard to imagine that happening. He says there is enough of everything, but more attention needs to be paid to trench electronic warfare. Again, notable that a couple key things there. One, saying we have everything we need. And that's not something we've heard throughout this war, really from either side, but from the Russian side, there's very few cases where Russian soldiers speak out and say, actually, hey, you know what? We got all we need. Everything's good. There's famously so many incidents of Russia saying we got problems. We don't have everything we need. Now they've found ways to navigate through that and continue pressing forward. Sometimes that comes at a heavy cost of equipment, other times at a heavy cost of lives. But according to this soldier, again, in the Kharkiv direction, it sounds like the Russian forces were well equipped and well prepared to kick this off. All things considered, a relatively small number. We're talking about 3 to 4 battalions in total. That was the original number that was thrown out there. I have not seen any updates to that number, which is important when looking at this context because that's likely not enough for Russia to be able to significantly break through the lines, right? They can continue to press forward slowly and chew away at Ukrainian positions, but it's probably not enough to be any sort of breakthrough, which, every time there's an offensive in this war, that tends to be a thought is there going to be a breakthrough? Is there going to be a collapse of the lines? And I understand why that mentality is there, but it's just unlikely, right? We've seen that so few times. And that's actually something that General Cavoli hit on just a couple days ago. Cavoli, of course, is kind of the senior U.S. commander in the region. He's the commander of U.S. European Command, as well as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And he said in an interview, the Russians don't have the numbers necessarily to do a strategic breakthrough. More to the point, they don't have the skill and the capability to do it, to operate at the scale necessary to exploit any breakthrough to strategic advantage. So a couple of pieces there. One, the numbers just aren't there to completely overwhelm the Ukrainian forces. It's not a 10-to-1 type troop advantage or even a 3-to-1 advantage at this point to be able to significantly break through or successfully break through the Ukrainian lines and exploit some sort of gap. But at the same time, we also haven't really seen that anywhere else along the front in a long, long time. The other part he points to is that the Russian, and going through his statement, he talks about how many Russian officers and senior leaders have died so far in this war that they don't have the experience anymore to carry out large-scale combined arms operations that could lead to some sort of breakthrough and exploitation. we'll see on that front. I think the same thing has been said in previous wars. When you see high levels of attrition, you think at some point the military is no longer capable of carrying out significant operations like that, and they tend to find a way. So I don't know that I would write them off entirely, saying that they don't have that skill set anymore, or it's no longer something that can be retrained or reinforced throughout the troops that remain. But either way, Cavoli kind of focusing in on the troop number just isn't there for any sort of significant breakthrough. And then the last account of the fighting here is coming from United 24, so again, a pro-Ukrainian source. And they're talking about some advances here that kind of highlight the reason I wanted to use this map over the deep state map. They say Russian forces continue to make movement in the direction of a handful of these villages. Attempts are being made to completely occupy Hlybok, right here, but the enemy has had no success. Reserves of the defense forces have been transferred to this area to stabilize the situation. Assault operations are being carried out in order to clear the area. The Muscovites regroup and entrench themselves in occupied lines, pull up additional infantry forces, but the defense forces meet them with fire. Now, Hlybok is an area that on deep state map shows as being, I think yesterday it was showing as still being in Ukrainian control, and today it might show as being in that gray zone, whereas Russian sources are saying that they have occupied that village now. So again, we've talked just in a recent video, I talked about how these maps don't really matter all that much. And throughout most of this war, that's the case. We are in a situation right now where there's constant changes on the battlefield with limited reports. So we're starting to see a pretty significant difference. It's just a few kilometers, but a pretty significant difference when talking about, Russia is saying this village has been taken, whereas Ukraine is saying that it's still in the gray zone. We're starting to see those differences arise in Kharkiv. But again, we'll keep an eye on this direction over the next couple days and weeks to see if it develops any further, and it'll help kind of understand what exactly Russia is trying to accomplish here. Again, three main things. Are they trying to divert Ukrainian forces away from elsewhere on the battlefield? Are they just trying to create some sort of buffer zone to prevent Ukrainian forces from pressing further into Belgorod and conducting cross-border raids? Or are they trying to push far enough in to where they can bring Kharkiv under tube artillery fire? Time will tell on that one, and I imagine we'll have more updates here in the next couple days. Then turning back to Russia, where Putin this last week appointed his former economic advisor, Andrei Belousov, as defense minister in a bit of a shakeup at the highest levels of the Russian government. Belousov takes the place of Shoigu, who had been the defense minister for 12 years. Shoigu was replaced. I don't think it's necessarily safe to say that he was fired or removed. He was moved to the head of the Russian Security Council. And in recent meetings with China, Shoigu has been right by Putin's side. Shoigu has been very loyal to Putin over the years, and there's been some rumblings inside of the Ministry of Defense to possibly replace him, but I think he's shown his loyalty to the point where he's not going to get embarrassed, he's not going to get removed, he's not going to get sacked. In a sense here, he was promoted up. Or that's it. He was promoted. He was promoted to a new role, a different role inside of the Russian government. So I want to look at a couple different Russia analysts here, because this is not my area of expertise, but of course it plays very much into how the war is going to shake out. Looking at a couple different Russia analysts here and their assessments and kind of talking through them. And I thought this was interesting because they kind of paint two very different situations of what this might mean. So the first one here, both of these posted on Twitter. The first one by Alexandra Prokopenko, a Russia analyst. She said, Russia's priority is a war of attrition. It is won by economics. Belousov is in favor of stimulating demand from the budget, which means that military spending will at least not decrease, but rather increase. So kind of a stance here that this war, as it rages on, there's going to be so much of an economic factor that it makes sense to have somebody in this position that has no military power or no military experience, but does have economic experience. And that lack of military experience for Belousov is going to come up again in a handful of critiques here. They say Belousov worked directly with Putin since 2008. He stood out in 2014 as the sole economist supporting the Crimea annexation, deeming its repercussions negligible. So again, this is somebody who's been loyal to Putin in the past. He's, especially related to some of the events in Ukraine. They say the Kremlin's gamble might hinge on his curtailing corruption. Belousov is 100% Putin's man, so the president's control over the Ministry of Defense increased. I think Putin had pretty strong control over the Ministry of Defense at baseline, so it's not shocking that he moved somebody into a key position that is already in his favor. It'd be strange anywhere in the world for a country at war to move somebody into a position like this, the head of the military, during a time of war that has some sort of contentious relationship with the head of state. So I do think we might overplay that one a little bit here and say, well, he's Putin's man and he's loyal to Putin. That's why he got moved in. That's going to be pretty similar for just about any country at war. Now, moving over to Darren Massicotte, another incredible Russia analyst here, has a little bit of a different take at the end of her assessment, where she says Shoigu is moving into a respectable and powerful position because he is loyal. He and Putin are friends. It's a signal that Putin listens to chatter and understands that Shoigu needed to leave the Ministry of Defense, where he was just tolerated by his own ministry and other agencies. Standard government there, right? Nothing out of the ordinary. She says Belousov has no military experience at all or background in the military. He's an economist. This will raise questions whether within the military, who will fear a repeat of Serdukov. I always feel like I'm saying that wrong. I'll come back to that in a second. So I anticipate some uniformed officer favorites appointed to leadership positions to balance this. Serdukov was an appointee he headed the Russian Ministry of Defense for a period of time in the early 2000s. He went about making some pretty significant reforms inside of the Russian military that were not necessarily popular. He tried to crack down on some corruption. During his time as the head of the Russian Ministry of Defense, there were a lot of senior officers that were removed and or arrested, and he had no military experience. And it was viewed by a lot of people in uniform as a problem. This guy didn't know what he was doing. He was causing issues. He was degrading the Russian military more than kind of facilitating their growth and power. So what Massicotte is saying is that inside of the Russian military, there very much might be that view of, hey, this guy that doesn't get us, he doesn't know what we're about, is coming in here. It could be bad for us, and there could be some pushback from people in uniform. So she expects a handful of more popular people in uniform, military personnel, to be promoted to various positions to kind of balance that out a bit. She says, I have to note that a person with this kind of financial background has no organizational ties or priors is helpful to making major changes to the defense economy to reconstitute the force post-war. And this is where this big difference is, just a couple words, but I feel like it's a big difference between Massicotte and what Prokopenko brought up here, where Prokopenko talks about how this war could go on for so long that Putin is bringing in an economist to help facilitate this war of attrition, whereas Massicotte brings up, albeit just kind of, she says, I have to note, keep this in mind, that this is the kind of guy that could be really good for a post-war reconstruction of the military. It's interesting, right? Like on the one hand, you would say this points to Russia thinking this war is going to go on for a long, long time, and the other, it's Russia might be thinking that this could wind down sometime in the near future. We need somebody in here who can kind of reconstitute the military, grow the military back up, and maybe institute some outside reforms to change things following this major conflict. Of course, it's the first few days since this man has been in the Ministry of Defense, so not a lot we can do in terms of projecting what this would look like in the months and years going forward. Again, notable that he has no military experience, that he's an economist. I can understand that in a sense, trying to get an outside view. But also, you have to wonder if there's not somebody in uniform that also has a bit of an outside view, or maybe a different point of view than what the traditional rank and file might have. But either way, pretty big shakeup in the Ministry of Defense. Again, Shoigu's been there clearly since the beginning of the war in Ukraine for 12 years. So we'll see if any significant changes come about from this change inside of the Russian Ministry of Defense. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if you're interested in this or other national security subjects, be sure to check out our Substack, which is linked in the description below. Substack's like a mix between a newsletter and website. You can sign up and get these articles direct to your inbox, or head over to the website. We've got written articles about Ukraine, Russia, Myanmar, Africa, Israel, Hezbollah, all sorts of things, as well as audio articles, podcasts, and quite a bit more. I think it's pretty interesting. If you want to check it out, of course, linked in the description below. But thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.